So next Thursday will be the Caroline Gervain Awards. And today I thought we'd talk about illness because a lot of times you hear the message of like, well, just listen to your body when you're sick. But what does that mean for someone like us who's in their 30s and 40s and really does appreciate training and kind of is just ready to get back to it or like stay in their sort of typical or normal schedule. So I want to kind of go through that with you today. I want to run through sort of my current season and experience and kind of go through some of the biggest mistakes that I see that I've made and that I imagine that a lot of us kind of struggle with. And then I also want to go through kind of like what I might call like a green, yellow, red framework. So basically, like how to decide if it's a good idea to train or not, and how I've sort of actively used that for myself. And then I want to also go through with you about kind of what it's looked like for me in terms of coming back from being sick, sort of my non negotiables versus negotiables. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about mindset reframes and kind of what that looks like. And I'll put my therapist hat on for a few minutes before I let you go today. So that's the plan for this live stream. But of course, if you're here live and you have a question, feel free to drop a comment and ask me the question. Otherwise, if you want to watch us back on the replay, feel free to ask those questions in the my brain's not working, in the comment section after this video is already live, and I'm happy to answer those as well. So first, let's talk about kind of where I was. So this has been kind of a crazy couple of months, honestly, really since like mid-January. We've been dealing with like on and off illness in the house, and I feel like a lot of folks are really going through that right now. I've been hearing in my personal life. Hey, Devin. Devin's here. Hi, Devin. I've been hearing a lot of people, talk about how much illness has been running through it. I think when you have fitness goals, that can make things really hard if you're A, sick, or B, if you're the caregiver of someone who is sick. I'm really talking about like my parents here, but that's certainly not exclusive, right? Like if you have aging parents who they're sick and you might be taking care of them. So I don't exclusively mean parents, but I do think a lot of that caregiving stuff happens with like, especially smaller kids, because they're just kind of gross, right? Like they have no sense of like what's going to make them sick and what's not going to make them sick. And so, you end up in sort of a situation where either you're sick or your loved one is sick and you're in that like caregiver mode. So I've been kind of dealing back and forth with that. A couple of my own illnesses. I think I've been sick 3 times, and then I've been caregiving kind of simultaneously slash, in addendum to all of that. So I think, it has really kind of put a damper on some of my training. I'm actually following Devin's program right now, who's live in the chat. And so it's caused me to be several weeks behind in my program. It's caused me to not be able to, lift as much. It's caused me to miss workouts and not really have as much stamina. So, I've had to kind of pivot and be flexible. And I think that's one of the biggest things is like flexibility is your best friend in kind of seasons like this. But if you're somebody like me, that can be really hard. I'm not a naturally flexible person. Um, Folks in the chat are saying, hi, welcome, glad you're here. So, that's one of those things for me where I have tried really hard to like stay as consistent as I can. And that's why I want to kind of walk through the kind of like green, yellow, red framework to figure out like, yes, it's a good idea to train, or maybe it's not a great idea to train, right? So let's talk about some of the common mistakes first. So the first mistake I see is like trying to go all in and try to be 100% and just like fake the funk. And, there is something to be said for not like quitting. If you feel fine, if your sleep is good and all that sort of stuff, then there is no reason you shouldn't attempt to train as you are. But oftentimes, one of the things I find I will do is I'm like, okay, well, I don't really have a good excuse. And so I go and I show up on the mat. And actually, this is what I did a few weeks ago. I end up making myself worse because I, try to push myself too hard in a workout rather than just waiting, maybe like another day or doing something a little less invasive on the front end. So, you don't necessarily have to always go in with the same intensity and the same weights and the same duration. You can sometimes just go in with less intensity to get that movement in without feeling like you have to go like all in or all out. And then the other one is the kind of like guilt mistake, right? And I feel like this is something that I will do to myself a lot, or used to do more frequently than I do now, is like feeling guilty that I'm not working out or feeling guilty that I'm not like going and training, when the reality of it is I truly don't feel well and my body needs me to rest more than it needs me to go pick up a pair of dumbbells. And, I think for many of us, if you're watching who, are like subscribed, you probably feel the same way I do, in that I am a person who likes to train. I really want to show up and train. It's good for my mental health, and all those sort of things too. So it is hard for me. Sometimes it's harder for me to just sit on the sidelines and not lift than it is for me to like actually show up. And so I'll feel guilty for not working out, or I'll feel guilty for, not showing up when my body is really trying to tell me to rest. And again, we'll go through that like green, yellow, red segment here in just a little bit. So but if you have questions as we go, feel free to stop me and ask them live, and I'm happy to answer them to the best of my abilities. I'm no doctor. I'm just a chick who likes to lift, and I've studied a lot of the stuff, and I've learned from my own personal experience. So, um, this is just sort of my own personal experience. So take that for what it's worth. Mistake number 3, I think, is a big one for mindset also. It's this sort of idea that like you've lost everything, or that it's going to completely derail you to miss a week. And I know, especially if you are early on in your, wellness, health, fitness journey or whatever, when you get sick, especially early on, it can feel like it's going to derail you because you've set this habit, right? And all of a sudden you have to stop the habit, and it feels like, well, how am I going to get my momentum back to do this habit again? And I think it's one of those situations where like you kind of have to learn to trust your body, right? You have to learn to trust yourself a little bit, and that does take time. It takes time and it takes patience. But I think if the key really for me is like to just start, when I'm actually feeling well. Again, that sort of teeters over into the like green, yellow, red framework. But just starting, moving your body a little bit and rebuilding the habit in windows of time, rather than assuming you need to be one extreme or the other. And then mistake number 4, ignoring symptoms, right? We've sort of touched on this in some of the previous ones, right? Ignoring your symptoms, pretending like you're not like tired or congested or whatever when you are. I mean, I think that really kind of speaks for itself. And then the mistake 5 that I kind of see and I have experienced for myself is the like the kind of trying to overcorrect, right? The food overcorrection. So you suddenly start to slash your calories, or you suddenly decide like you need to go super hard in all your next workouts, or you need to make up all of the workouts that you've missed like in 2 days. Like if you missed 5 workouts, you're like, okay, well, I got to double up every day until I get caught up. And I think that can really derail us as well, both from a physical health and from a mindset standpoint. Let's talk a little bit about this like green, yellow, red framework I've been teasing about, kind of as we've gone. So red days for me, again, I'm not a doctor. This is just kind of how I look at it from my own perspective. And I don't obviously call it red, yellow, green in my personal life. It's just kind of a way to sort of simplify it. So red days are basically days where I've got fever, if I have an active fever, body aches, and like I really just can't get off the couch, right? Like I can only do the bare minimum. That is not a day that I'm going to train, right? Perhaps it's, low energy, low congestion. My sleep is probably poor, especially if it's like a congestion issue, and dealing with like upper respiratory. I have a lot of issues like sleeping, and I think most of us do. So, when you're, um, when you're congested, it can make it really difficult to sleep well too. And that also impacts our ability to recover. So, on those days, I just rest. I rest, I fuel my body, and we'll talk a little bit more about like what I actually do, like while I'm recovering to maintain as much as I can. But we'll get into that here in just a minute. So then those are the red days. Yellow days are basically when I'm a little bit better. Usually, like one of the things my husband and I say to each other that I will say to him is, I'm like, I feel like I'm at like 75%, or I'm at like 50%, or I'm 80% today, back to normal. And so I kind of think like in percentages. And so for me, yellow days are probably like 70% better, right? I'm not at a 1. I'm not at a 1. I'm not at, a 10 on a like scaling system, right? But I'm certainly not, I'm not fully back to my usual business. So on yellow days, I'm better but not normal. I still might have some lower energy or still maybe even teetering with some congestion. My sleep maybe is better, maybe is not. Sleep for me personally is one that I really struggle with because sleep is, I'm not a fun person to be around when I haven't slept. So um, I'm not a fun human when I haven't slept. I've always been like that. I think some people are more sensitive to sleep than others, and I just happen to be one of those. So like I could work out potentially, with, I could potentially work out with like congestion, but if I haven't slept well, for me, that might teeter me in the direction of not lifting that day. Um, so again, that's going to put me at like 50 to 70% of action, meaning like I'm more likely to, I'm looking at my notes because I can't be trusted to stay on script. Um, that might mean lighter weights or shorter sessions or just more rest in between sets. So um, the chances are I'm probably going to at least show up to the mat. I might do some yoga. I might like walk on like the walking pad, or if it's nice outside, go for a walk. I might show up and use lighter weights that day, things like that. Or I might take more rest in between the sets themselves. Um, I'm more likely to do something like an upper body day than an extreme lower body day. And if I'm doing lower body, it's probably either body weight or like lighter weights. And then green days obviously are, when you're at least closer. For me, typically that's like 80 to 90%. And I would say like that kind of falls into, pretty solid sleep, right? You're not so congested or sick that your sleep is being impacted, or, that your appetite's like sort of relatively back to normal. Often by this point in the game, I'm ready to get back to lifting. I'm ready to get back moving. Otherwise I like kind of just look at my weight room like, I kind of like to, but like, you know that feeling, right? When you're kind of like itching to move. And so that's sort of when I start to build back up. And, I've been training for quite a few years at this point. Let's see, how long have I been lifting? I've been lifting since 2020, like full blown since 2021. We're in 2026. Is it 2026? That's sad. I don't know that. Is it 2026? I believe it is. Yes, that sounds right. So, I've been, 5 to 6 years at this point. And so depending on where you are, depends on how quickly you might be able to progress back to your normal. Like for me, usually I will do a workout or so where I'm kind of like easing back in. And then by like workout 3 or 4, I'm back to my usual amounts. But everybody's different. And so you really do, in that way, you do kind of have to do the like sort of telltale listen to your body, right? You can show up, test it, and notice like, wait, I don't feel good. I should sit back down. And I will do that. I've done that in the past where like I go and I'm like trying to work out, but I'm not feeling it. And I'm like, I still don't feel up to it. So then I'll either scale back or I'll just put the weights away and, go walk away. But that might look like something like, week 1, you're at like 70%, then into week 2, 80 to 85%, and then into week 3, you're like back to normal. If you're newer, in lifting, and also depending on how sick you were, right? For some of us, illnesses are going to vary, right? If it's something super contagious or you're like really congested or something like that, you might not feel better for like a week and a half, 2 weeks. Whereas if it's something, I can't come up with any like good illnesses right now. But my point being is it kind of depends on the illness, right? Hello, welcome. So let's talk about sort of what I've done or, how I sort of handle it personally when I come back. We've talked about, in the first part, we talked about mistakes. In the second part, we talked about the red, yellow, green sort of format that you might follow. For me personally, what that kind of looks like, we've talked a lot about the workouts, but really for me, it is about sort of deciding the red, yellow, green of sorts of the days of the week that I'm going to lift or go back to exercising. But while I'm sick, I don't live in a calorie deficit. It's really important to me that I'm fueling my body properly. I almost always want more carbs when I'm sick. And so because of that, it's really important to me that I'm continuing to fuel my body. So, I had actually kind of attempted a calorie deficit. That was the plan, in January, to go into like a slight deficit, but it hasn't been able to happen because I can't stay in a deficit for any consistent amount of time because every time I start a deficit, I end up getting sick. So, it just hasn't worked out the way I had hoped. Best laid plans, right? Lots of opportunities to be flexible. And so what that looked like for me this sort of season is just trying to listen to my body. I do have a tendency to eat like a toddler when I'm sick. And so I do allow myself a bit more indulgence, but I try not to go crazy. I'm fortunate that I know my body pretty well now. I'm in a relatively what's the word I'm looking for? I'm in a relative season where like I'm aware of what like works for me and kind of like where I need to be from a calorie budget standpoint. But depending on where you are, if you're somebody who struggles with like food noise or things like that, that part might be harder for you than others. But again, I don't live in a deficit when I'm sick. If I'm in a deficit, I take myself out of a deficit and I live in exclusively maintenance calories. And I also prioritize more carbs. Honestly, I typically just don't have quite the appetite for protein. I'm sure there's like a biological like piece to that. I just don't know what it is. Off the top of my head, I'm sure I could like Google it, but I don't know off the top of my head. But I do try to get my protein goal in and prioritize that, even though I don't always necessarily feel like eating my protein goal. Um, and then planned rest days. Obviously, this is something we've talked about quite a bit. Is I definitely, you know, prioritize rest over training. If I feel up to walking, I walk, or if I feel up to doing some yoga, I will. But otherwise, I just sort of I rest more, right? And it depends on kind of who you are and what you got going on, right? Like if you're like me and you're a parent, then for you, a lot of times um, rest is something that is not always easy to come by unless your kid is at school or the case may be. So you kind of have to be um, do the best you can, right? Do the best you can to rest as much as you possibly can. And then again, my non-negotiables, I prioritize my sleep. No, I am not a teacher. I would not make a very good teacher. Uh, um, but I prioritize, hitting my sleep targets to the best of my ability. Like I said, if I'm congested and that makes that difficult, but as a general rule, my sleep is non-negotiable. I go to bed and get up at the same times, or I might sleep in a bit more again to prioritize my rest and my sleep itself. We talked about protein, water. I try to make sure I'm drinking lots of water. I'm staying well hydrated. And then again, as much movement as I feel comfortable doing based on that like sort of green, yellow, red format. So let me put on my little therapist cap for a bit, if you'll allow me to do so, and talk a little bit about like mindset reframes, because I think that's really important. And really and truly, you know, flexibility, mental flexibility, not flexibility, mental flexibility is the key to being successful in these sort of seasons, right? Because I think a lot of times, especially early on, when we get in our head about illness and things like that, it looks like a setback. Whereas I think illness is sort of a normal part of life, right? Regardless of if you're a parent, sometimes maybe you're more sick than your average person because kids will cough in your eyeballs and just not care, because that's just kids. But if even if you're not a parent, though, we're all still susceptible to germs and illness, and depending on our immunity systems and all that sort of stuff. So for me, it's really important to reframe it as a season, not as a complete setback, because the reality of it is you won't lose everything in just a couple of weeks, right? Best efforts and getting back on track and not beating yourself up for missing workouts or missing things, and just keeping as much consistent as you can while you can't move the way that you'd like to move is really kind of the name of the game, right? And it is really all about kind of the identity shift, right? I'm the person who trains. I'm not only successful when I'm perfect, right? It's not about getting it perfect all the time. It's not about getting the magic number of steps or, training a certain number of days a week. It's about being the person who trains, being the person who takes care of their body. Um, and also just kind of allowing ourselves to come back and not beating ourselves up when we came back, right? Just saying like, okay, good. I'm feeling good. I'm going to show up. And then just show up, right? In whatever way feels comfortable or good for you. So that's kind of what I wanted to share today. If, again, hopefully the Caroline video will be up next week and we can get all the tech stuff sorted. I'm not thrilled, but I'm being flexible. Don't I love that? So if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the chat regarding either the mistakes, the format, or, just a different question about, you know, illness and getting back on track and things like that. And I really hope this video was helpful and provided some value for you today. because that was the goal since, the video, the long form didn't get to go up the way that I'd hoped it would today. That's just life. So, yeah, that's all I got for now. Any questions regarding the stuff about really any of the illness stuff? And then I will go. Yeah, I don't see any questions rolling in. So thank you guys to those of you who are here. Thank you so much for being here. If you love it, make sure you subscribe if you haven't done so already. This is the place for those of us who love to train, who like to work out, and who want to be the best version of ourselves for many years to come. So I'd love if you'd subscribe if you haven't done so already. Make sure you stay tuned for next week's long form video. And feel free, if you're watching this on the replay, to leave me a comment and ask me any questions around this stuff as well. So thanks for watching. Bye, friends.